Hi everyone, welcome to the lecture about interior finish for CT81. This right here is a picture of the interior of the Gamble House. I've talked about this before. Green and Green were architect brothers in the early 20th century that designed these super bungalows. This one's in Pasadena. It's pretty awesome. Features a lot of teak and pretty incredible joinery. So we're not going to be doing anything on that level, but I thought it was an interesting picture. So moving on. When we talk about interior finish, as soon as all the drywall is done, as soon as the exterior is dried in, meaning it's not going to rain inside the house anymore, we can go in and start completing the inside of the house. A key term is casing, and we'll get to this in a minute, but when we talk about trim, that's kind of an umbrella term for the interior finish in the house. And then there are different components of the trim. So if we talk about casing, it's a piece of trim or a piece of molding that gets applied to the doors and the windows. When we talk about baseboard, it's a piece of trim that gets attached to the wall at the floor level. What we're trying to do at this point on the house is get ready to paint everything and get ready to install cabinets. So, like I said, trim is an umbrella term, and it serves two purposes really. It ends up being decorative, but all of this trim, all of these moldings we're going to talk about, started out serving a functional purpose. So, for example, when we install baseboard, we're hiding the transition from floor to wall. Okay, and if you look right here, this piece of molding is called base shoe, and that's a pretty important piece of molding that further conceals the transition from floor to wall. Okay, so the baseboard gets applied to the wall. Sometimes the floor is uneven and there's little dips and high spots, and you can either scribe the baseboard to perfectly match the contours of the floor, or you can install this piece of base shoe, and that's going to be much more flexible and allow you to follow the contours of the floor much better. Okay. If we're hiding a transition from the wall to ceiling, a lot of times we're going to use what we call crown molding. We'll talk more about that. And then when we apply casing, we're concealing the gaps between the rough wall surface, the rough framing, and the drywall. Okay? The casing gets applied flat to the wall, it's on the same plane of the wall, and conceals the gaps. Okay? There are some moldings like chair rail that we'll talk about that are going to protect walls from like getting beat up, and they were a lot more important when most of the wall surfaces were finished with plaster, which was really brittle. And if you had something like a chair slamming into the wall, it might crack the plaster. Okay, it's not as big of a deal now that most of our walls are drywall. So chair rail, like I just mentioned, it was used to protect the wall from getting banged up by the chairs. The traditional height for the chair rail is 36 inches, and that was a good height they determined to meet the back of a chair. Okay, someone's at the dinner table and they slide their chair back from the table and crash into the wall, and it could crack the plaster. So the chair rail was meant to protect the plaster. Now I would say its purpose is more to divide spaces on the wall. Okay, it can kind of serve as like a transition between wainscoting. If we have wainscoting, that would be traditionally vertically installed wood or some sort of beadboard, and then you would put a piece of chair rail on top of that to transition into the drywall or the plaster. Picture rail is a pretty neat molding that we use to hang pictures from the wall. It gets nailed flat to the wall, not to be confused with crown molding, which we'll talk about here in a minute. But again, the picture rail has its origins in plaster walls. If you tried to pound a nail through a plaster wall or drive a screw through a plaster wall, you would destroy the plaster, probably crack it, and it's difficult to repair. So what they would do is they would nail picture rail onto the wall, and then you'd have these special hooks that hang from the picture rail, and then you would use ribbon or wire or something like that and suspend the pictures from that. I like putting picture rail up in my house. The thing that I like about the picture rail is you can rearrange it as much as you want. If you don't want the picture there anymore, you can move it somewhere else. It really lends itself to redecorating and rearranging things. And then the other thing that's nice about it is when you use this, the pictures should hang plumb. Okay, they're suspended from something, they should hang plumb. Whereas if you have what most people have, a wire on the back of a picture that hangs on a nail or a screw, what tends to happen is that picture moves back and forth and gets out of level, and that kind of thing drives me crazy. I don't know about you all, but I find that with the picture rail, they tend to just hang plumb. Crown molding is a special kind of trim, and what it does is, you know it's crown molding when it forms a triangle at the ceiling and the wall. Okay, it doesn't get nailed flat to the ceiling or flat to the wall. Okay, it's always at an angle. This traditionally was used to hide the transition between the wall and the ceiling, because oftentimes what would happen is it would crack there. At that joint, there would be a lot of movement, and with plaster walls, that plaster would want to crack because plaster isn't very forgiving if the house moves. Okay, so you put a piece of crown molding up there, it cracks, nobody knows there's a crack back there. Okay, an important term to remember when we're talking about crown molding is the spring angle, and that is the angle that it seats against the wall. Okay, so right here you can see this is the angle here that it's projecting off the wall. That's the spring angle. Okay, there's three options generally for crown molding. 45, 45 is the most common crown molding because it's easy for people to make. It's easy for people to understand how to install it. 38-degree crown molding is not as common. It's used for shorter walls. Okay, 52-degree crown molding, and again that's represented by this angle here. 52-degree crown molding is usually used for taller walls. Okay, and so the idea behind that is the taller the wall, the farther away it is from you, so it's going to be flatter so that you have a better visual on the details of the crown molding. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. The tricky thing with the crown molding is that it needs to be cut at a compound miter or coped. There's a couple different ways of cutting and installing the crown molding. We'll talk about that. A compound miter, just a little refresher, is when you are cutting a bevel and a miter at the same time. And it gets tricky when you're trying to do this because if you're trying to cut a 45-degree angle at the corner, it's not a 45-degree angle on your saw because of this spring angle. Okay, because it's already sitting at an angle other than 90 degrees, you can't just set the saw to 45 degrees and cut it. Okay, we'll talk about that a little more here. So here's a picture of the spring angles. Like I said, the 38 would be for shorter walls. You're not as far away from the crown molding, so it's a little more vertical and it's easier for people to see the profile. With the 52-degree crown molding, it's a little more horizontal because the walls are taller and you're standing down on the ground and you're looking up, and it's easier to see that profile. Okay, and then this is the other thing. The decorative part of the crown molding is always going to go down. Okay, and then 45 degrees is somewhere in between. Okay, all right. Here is a crown molding chart. So if you were going to cut crown molding on your dual bevel miter saw, you would first have to determine the angle of the wall intersection. Okay, it's supposed to be 90 degrees, but it's probably not 90 degrees. And what you're going to do is you're going to get your bevel square, your T-bevel square, and you're going to set it to whatever that angle actually is. Maybe it's 89 degrees. Maybe it's 91 degrees, okay? Next thing you're going to do is determine the angle of the crown molding you got, okay? Is that crown molding 52 degree crown, or is it 38 degree crown, or is it 45 degree crown? The way you're going to do that is you're going to set that crown molding on a piece of plywood or something like that. What I would do is I would draw a square line on the piece of plywood. I would set the crown molding on that line so that the bottom edge of that crown molding is parallel with that line. And then you can trace the hypotenuse made by that crown molding, set your bevel square to that, and you can determine what the angle is that way. Okay. Once you've determined if you've got 52 degree crown or 45 degree crown, you can come to this chart. Okay, I've got 89 degrees as my wall ceiling intersection, and I'm using 52 degree crown molding. What I'm going to do is I'm going to set the miter, okay, remember that's the table on the saw where the saw just swings back and forth, okay? I'm going to set that to 32.07 degrees, okay? Good luck with that. 32 degrees is probably close enough. You're going to set the bevel to 34.2 degrees, okay? That is when the arm of the saw actually swings back and forth. Okay, you loosen the knob on the back of the saw usually, or on the Bosch saw, it's on the front, and then the whole arm pivots back and forth. So you're going to set that to 34.2 degrees, and then when you cut the crown molding, you're going to end up with an inside corner or an outside corner. Figuring out which way to swing the bevel and which way to swing the miter, okay, because if your saw is just set at 0, you can go right or left 45 degrees in either direction. Okay, so you're going to have to figure out which way to set that in order to cut the crown molding the right way. Okay, so that's probably more of a demonstration when I'm actually out at the house cutting crown molding. Okay. All right. This is a video, This Old House video, about cutting crown molding. That's pretty good. And what they did different than what I just talked about is they actually nested the crown molding in the saw. And you'll see in the video what they do is they flip the crown molding upside down. Okay, they treat the bottom of the crown molding, they push that up against the fence of the saw, and they pretend like that is the wall. Okay, it's kind of a way to think about it. And then the table is like the ceiling. Okay, so it's kind of upside down when you're looking at it. And then what they can do is they can just set the saw to 45 degrees and just cut it like normal. Okay, they're pretending like that crown molding is already at the spring angle. Okay, they're using the fence of the saw and the table of the saw to act as the wall on the ceiling, and then they're cutting it like normal. Okay, if you wanted to do the opposite and just cut it on the flat, just set it flat on the table of the saw, that's when you would go to that crown molding chart that we just talked about and set the miter to the appropriate angle, set the bevel to the appropriate angle. Okay, enjoy that video.